This is the Sunday that the church, for a very long time, not always, but for a very long time, has designated as Trinity Sunday. Trinity, the notion at its root that we worship one God who is known in many ways. So I would actually suggest renaming this Sunday, if it's all right with you. May we call it One God Known in Many Ways Sunday. I'd like to do that. One God, St. Augustine wrote, the one beginning of all things, the wisdom by which every soul is wise, the gift by which all things blessed are blessed, the form we follow after, the grace by which we are reconciled, the one God whose creation gives us life. Now that's just an excerpt from Augustine on the Trinity. He actually wrote over 800 pages about the Trinity. And then he concluded that he just didn't get it after 800 pages. Well, the thing is, Augustine isn't alone. Where in the world did the church get such a confusing notion? But maybe more importantly for today, I ask, what is the spiritual truth that this notion holds for us? We may not, many of us, probably most of us, embrace the rigid doctrine of the Trinity. But I would suggest that the notion of one God known in many ways speaks to something true and profound and invites us, whoever we are, wherever we are, to connect deeply with this one of whom we speak. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann suggests that the doctrine of the Trinity is the church's somewhat enigmatic attempt to witness to the link between the risen historical person of Jesus and the universal force of God's presence. So he's saying that those who follow Jesus recognize something of God, like the God, in Jesus. So our question for the day is, how is God with us? There, of course, is no single answer, and the church has never been able to establish a simple conclusion. We're kind of in the same boat as Augustine. Perhaps we might, as preacher Barbara Brown Taylor suggests, simply confess, state what it is like to be in the presence of God. But the problem is, she continues, is that God rarely comes to us twice in the same way. Today we might feel an inexplicable comfort in the face of sorrow. Yesterday, the Spirit's conviction led us to apologize for our mean-spirited action. And we may remember the palatable presence of Jesus as we summoned up the courage to have a difficult conversation. These are all ways that God comes to us. One God, known in many ways. The origin of this Trinitarian doctrine begs us, I believe, to question its place as absolute truth about how God is known. For you see, the notion of Trinity and the word Trinity is not in Scripture. But it was formulated at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century after Jesus. 4 centuries, 400 years before anybody said the word Trinity. And the Bible itself, I think this is the best testimony, the Bible itself goes way beyond 3. Way beyond 3 ways that God is known. The Spirit appears, manifests itself in many ways, some grand, some simple. And so today I invite us to consider just a few of the ways we encounter and experience God. The first person of the Trinity is often named as Father. I would suggest that we experience this parenthood of God mostly in creation. So we experience the God we know as Creator, the one God called Abba, Father, by Jesus, maker of heaven and earth, mother who birthed into being this world and everything that's within it, the one the Genesis creation stories laud as bringing forth life from nothing and then sustaining it. God, the transcendent one, beyond us somewhere, sovereign over that creation, judge of its goodness, the one revealed in the law and prophets, the one who leads the Hebrew people to freedom by cloud and feeds with manna. This one is indeed God of many names. Yahweh, Adonai, El Shaddai, Shekinah. We could go on, male and female, from matriarchal and patriarchal periods of religious history. This majestic presence of God is revealed to us most readily in the natural world. Creator lives within creation, in the craggy edges of rugged mountains, in the beauty and life of rushing streams. In the deep expanse of our ever-changing skies, God lives. We meet God in the awe of the created variety of our world. Many of us speak of encountering God in creation's solitude and wildness. Barbara Brown Taylor again speaks to us of Trinity and reminds us of what we already know when she says this: "The easiest practice of reverence I know is simply to sit down somewhere outside, preferably near a body of water, and pay attention for 20 minutes. Just take those 3 square feet of earth on which you're sitting, paying close attention to everything that lives within that small estate. And thereby, we know its creator. Creation embodies creator. God permeates and lives in all that is." How is God with us? As those who follow Jesus, we experience holiness in Emmanuel, God with us, embodied in the person of Jesus as he healed, embraced all as God's beloved, and poured himself out for the sake of love. Those around Jesus when he was on earth were convinced through him that God was still alive in the world. You know, a lot of people didn't believe that. It was like God had been silent for how many hundred years, and so we're not sure God is even there. And Jesus convinced people that God was still alive in the world. In Jesus, the disciples found themselves confronted with an inexplicable reality. As they followed and watched and experienced him, they began to realize that there was something uniquely God-like about Jesus. God came to life in him. Even though Jesus told them that they could be and do all the things that he was and did, there was still something set apart, something holy about Jesus. He identified his work with God's work and his will with God's will. "I am in God and God is in me," Jesus says in the Gospel of John. God was with him and in him and through him. But the reality is, the reality that God can be known in human form predates Jesus, as we heard in our reading from Proverbs today. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible tells of this one that we call Lady Wisdom. Wisdom, Sophia in Greek, Hakma in Hebrew, walks among humans as the presence of God. Do you know her? Have you heard of her? Heard of Sophia? Oh. Choir gets brownie points this morning. Sophia, wisdom, appears in Proverbs and in a few apocryphal books as divinity in human form. Many scholars have recognized and understood her as a female personification of God's creating and saving action in the world. We see Sophia on the streets. We hear her calling out for justice and for right behavior. She preaches, Proverbs tells us, at the crossroads. That means in the center of everything, in public. And her proclamation, she says, is universal. Her words are for all the world to hear. Sometimes she weeps over the violence in humanity. Other times she dances in delight. Jesus, scholars tell us, is related to the Sophia of God. In fact, Paul calls Jesus the wisdom, Sophia, of God. And John suggests that, like Sophia, Jesus is with God in the beginning of creation. Wisdom summons us with this divine voice, calling us to come and eat at her table. So Sophia invites us to a sacramental table. Like Jesus, she offers the bread of life. Not manna from heaven, exactly. Certainly not the body and blood of Christ. But life-giving provision nonetheless that emanates from God and promises to sustain us. So we know God as God with us. Christ, Sophia, walking among us. How is God with us? In Creator and creation, in Christ and wisdom. God is with us as Spirit. When Jesus leaves, or when He prepares to leave, He promises to be with them always. And He tells them at that time of another sort of God presence. In the Advocate, the Comforter, as Jesus says, He implied that God's revelation would continue in yet another way. The Spirit. Now, is this the Spirit of God? Or is this the Spirit of the resurrected Christ? Or is this something else altogether? The Spirit, as we talked about last week on Pentecost, the Spirit is breath and energy of God. The Spirit is guide and comforter, disturber and reconciler. The Spirit lives where? The Spirit lives within us. Spirit stirs within us, lights those fires of passion that move us. The Spirit warms our heart and calls us to faith. Many expressions already, and we've only scratched the surface. But the church began to speak of these varied experiences as the many faces of God. But this is where it's confusing, because the Scriptures make it clear that God is one who creates and relates to humankind in many ways. As diverse as these experiences were, the early church came to believe that they all expressed the one same God of both hidden majesty and experienced grace. We remember when Jesus was asked what was the first and greatest commandment, He quoted from Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." While other cultures worshipped many gods, the Jews claimed, including Jesus, claimed that God is one. So He didn't set Himself out as another person of the Trinity. God is one. God is known in many ways. John of Damascus, a Greek theologian who lived in the 7th century, developed this beautiful concept called perichoresis. There's your $5 word for your next party. Perichoresis. Peri simply means around, and choresis means dancing. So perichoresis, dancing around. His contention was that manifestations of God, ways that God is known, are all dancers in this world, in the cosmos, holding hands, dancing around together among us in harmonious, joyous freedom, freedom to move and to be known. Now, all this might be interesting theology, or not, but what in the world could this possibly have to do with how we live our spiritual lives? What is it we could discover on this One God Known in Many Ways Sunday that could help us live our lives as God's people here and now? What might we find that can illumine our faith and give it fuller life? Could speculations about a God who is with us in many ways offer us something for today? Here's one thing. If we listen to the Scriptures, if we listen to history, if we listen, we'll hear stories of God's love and healing, of God's wisdom and transforming power that are manifest and imparted in countless forms. God has been known, I believe, by all people, in all times and cultures, in love, beauty, power, wonder, and mystery, in sweet communion and amazing grace. Listen. Listen. Do you hear those stories? Do you remember them? If we listen, we'll hear each other's stories. If we listen, our hearts will bring us to our own memories of how God was with us. Was that God? Was that God who guided me to seek out that person who was hurting? Just to give them a touch or a hug? Might it really have been the Spirit who led me to let go of that harmful behavior that I just couldn't let go? Could it have been God who gave me the power to be kind when all I wanted to do was lash out? Could that have been God? Could it have been God who sat with me when I felt so lonely and deserted and betrayed that all I wanted to do was stop it all? Was that the Spirit? You see, my friends, if we think for a moment that God is moving and dancing and breathing and swirling and speaking all around us in more ways than we could imagine, perhaps we'll catch a glimpse of it. Perhaps we'll see and connect and feel loved and held in ways that we long for. Listen to that again. If we can believe even for a moment that God is still moving, dancing, breathing, speaking, swirling all around us in more ways than we can imagine, perhaps we'll catch a glimpse of it. Perhaps we'll see God and experience God and feel loved and held and helped. God is with us in many ways, some surprising, some familiar, some comforting. Sometimes, as Alice Walker said, God manifests even when we aren't looking. One God known in many ways. How does God come to you? What is your sweetest communion? Perhaps you haven't even named it as God. What is that place of your deepest wonder? How is God made known to you? How is God made known to someone else in you and through you? Whose holy company do you keep? That's God. Where do you find it? We experience and believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth, the one known in many ways and by many names. But we rob ourselves, my friends, of the fullness of this God who's known in many ways when we privatize our faith, when we keep those experiences of God to ourselves and never speak them or share them, when we don't listen or ask questions of others who experience God, when we confide only in our own experiences of God, we miss the many ways that God is moving around us. So, why would God come to us in so many and varied ways? Why can't the Bible just say it and describe it and that just settles it? Why? Because we human beings need it. We human beings need God. And so love that God is designs way after way after way after way to hope to connect with us. When the way of last generation doesn't seem to break through to us here and now, there always seems to be another sighting of God, another glimpse of hope, another path to freedom, other ways to permeate our intellect, our bodies, our hearts, new ways of seeing, new voices that speak the language of love. And so I ask us this morning, I ask myself and I ask you, are you ready to experience God? It may be in ways that you've never thought of, in ways that you've never thought of naming as Spirit or God. But that's the important question for today. Are we ready? Are we ready to open our eyes and see things we've never seen before? Are we ready to open our hearts and feel things we've never felt before? Are we ready to look around and look within? Are we ready to have the courage to recognize God in whatever way God moves and speaks? And then are we willing and ready to realize that and say, oh, it's you. It's you. Wow. And thank you. Thank you. My friends, God is moving, speaking, holding, inspiring, challenging, comforting, convicting, and calling. Do we? Will we hear? Will we see and feel? Open your hearts. God is here. Amen. Link between the risen historical person of Jesus and the universal force of God's presence. So he's saying that those who follow Jesus recognize something of God, like the God, in Jesus. So our question for the day is, how is God with us? There, of course, is no single answer, and the church has never been able to establish a simple conclusion. We're kind of in the same boat as Augustine. Perhaps we might, gives us life. Now, that's just an excerpt from Augustine on the Trinity. He actually wrote over 800 pages about the Trinity, and then he concluded that he just didn't get it after 800 pages. Well, the thing is, Augustine isn't alone. Where in the world did the church get such a confusing notion? But maybe more importantly for today, I ask, what is the spiritual truth that this notion holds for us? We may not, many of us, probably most of us, embrace the rigid doctrine of the Trinity. But I would suggest that the notion of one God, known in many ways, speaks to something true and profound, and invites us, whoever we are, wherever we are, to connect deeply with this one of whom we speak. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann suggests that the doctrine of the Trinity is the church's somewhat enigmatic attempt to witness to the This is the Sunday that the church, for a very long time, not always, but for a very long time, has designated as Trinity Sunday. Trinity, the notion at its root that we worship one God who is known in many ways. So I would actually suggest renaming this Sunday, if it's all right with you. May we call it One God Known in Many Ways Sunday. I'd like to do that. One God, St. Augustine wrote, the one beginning of all things, the wisdom by which every soul is wise, the gift by which all things blessed are blessed, the form we follow after, the grace by which we are reconciled, the one God whose creation